Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and today is Friday the 13th. I just like to say it because, ooh, it's spooky. I know, I'm very silly sometimes, most of the time. At any rate, we are not going to talk about Friday the 13th today. We are going to talk about relationships because I recently had the opportunity to do an interview for the GSMC Relationship Podcast, actually, with author Larry Shushansky regarding his book, Independent Enough, a book about relationships. And I don't do a lot of self-help books on the Book Review Podcast, not because I have anything against them, just, depends on what I'm being sent for authors and author interviews. At any rate, like I said, I had the opportunity to do this for the Relationship Podcast and thought, hey, it's a book. I do a Book Review Podcast. Why don't I go ahead and do this on the Book Review Podcast as well? So, like I said, the book is called Independent Enough, a book about relationships. And the cover says, our happiness and well-being is determined by the quality of interactions we have with others. The back of the book says, in our culture, being independent is highly valued, but being totally independent is impossible. We depend on the many relationships in our lives, not because we rely on other people, but because through relationships, we become aware of changes we need to make. The most meaningful and lasting changes do not come from pleasing others. They don't come about by what others do for us. They come from taking a look at ourselves within the context of our relationships before deciding what we need to do to improve our relationships. Independent Enough is about creating the relationships we want, regardless of what someone else is doing. It's about becoming happier by maintaining enough psychological distance to remain intact and staying close enough to have meaningful interactions. Being strong enough, insightful enough, and persistent enough, we can lead our relationships in the positive directions we want them to go. That is the description of Independent Enough by Larry Shushansky. Larry takes the experiences that he's had in his own life, not only his personal experience, but also his experiences as a therapist, and brings them together in this book to talk about what it means to be independent enough, what that means for our relationships. That, you might hear that sentence on the front of the book, our happiness and well-being is determined by the quality of interactions we have with others. That doesn't mean that our happiness is dependent on others. It's dependent on our being able to recognize the quality of our interactions, to be able to, I don't want to say control, but be able to know ourselves well enough that our interactions with others reflect our knowing ourselves, while realizing that relationships are about dependency, not codependency, but being dependent on one another. We are always dependent in some way on our relationships. So Larry's going to explain it much better in this interview. Let's go ahead and get to that. Again, the book is called Independent Enough by Larry Shushansky. Hi, Larry. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for having me. I appreciate that a lot.
Thanks for being here. I'm excited to talk to you about your book. It's called Independent Enough, a book about relationships. Before we get to the book, though, if you could share a little something about yourself so our listeners can get to know you, that would be great.
Sure. I was born in the South, in Norfolk, Virginia, actually. And we spent every summer down at Virginia Beach, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful experience and lots of fun. We'd be in the water from 8 in the morning until dinner time. And I think if my upbringing had just stopped there, it would have been pretty good. But my father was abusive, particularly to me. In fact, I remember once where he thought I'd lost a 25-cent screwdriver, and he almost beat me to death at one time. And so I took quite a lot of beatings. Yeah, I took quite a lot of beatings. And as a result, I mean, it's probably a combination of a lot of different things. But when I finally went off to college, I was really immature and really had no idea of how to navigate people and situations and relationships. And I was just an absolute wreck. And by the time I was 20, I was actually sticking needles in my arm. I can actually remember the first time in my dorm room when I stuck a needle in my arm, and the rush was just like so intense and just that's the best way to just so intense that I ran to the sink of my dorm room and I threw up. And from there, I did a lot of alcohol and a lot more drugs and became addicted, and eventually I got drafted because I failed out of school. And did my stint in service, went back to school, went back to graduate school, and became really interested in family systems because I guess I had such a hard time with relationships. I just wanted to see what that was all about. And I've actually been trying to write this book for about 35 years, Sarah. It just, and I've never had the wherewithal to get it off the ground. And I've written thousands and thousands of pages, and it never coagulated. It never just got culminated. And then in 1991, I was diagnosed with hepatitis C, which stemmed from my drug years. And that was in my almost, I was about 40 at that point, or close to being 40 at that point. Excuse me. And that was tough. I went through 2 trials of interferon and ribavirin. One of them almost killed me, so they had to take me off. My platelet counts dropped so much. Then I stopped all treatments totally. They just couldn't find something that was working. And I made a commitment to go straight. I haven't had a drink or any kind of drugs for about 30 years now. I made a commitment to my spirituality and made a commitment to eating better, exercising, and kind of just being a decent person. And I did that. And about 3 years ago, I was in a stage 3 trial for a new medication for the hepatitis C, and within 2 weeks it was gone. It was truly like a miracle. I didn't realize that all those, it was something. It was like I'd known myself for the first time in my life. I had energy. I didn't have to take naps. I wasn't depressed anymore. And that all that work I had done for so many years kind of just coagulated in my head, and it was just sharp. And that's when I was able to write the book. And since then, I've written the book. I've been on podcasts and radio stations, and my purpose is to get the ideas behind the book out as much as possible, because I think that one of the core issues in our lives that contribute to our well-being and happiness are relationships. And most of us don't do it very well. And I'm included in that. I've gotten a lot better, I can tell you that, since getting clean and since being cured of the Hep C. I've been able to do the work that I've wanted to do for so many years. So that's my story in a nutshell.
Wow, that's quite the journey, and it's pretty amazing that it led you to this place and to writing this book. Which, one thing that I really appreciate about the book is that the chapters are not terribly long, so you can just kind of sit down and take in a chapter and go through it at your own pace.
Right.
I think that's really good for people in kind of this busy world right now to be able to just kind of take it in pieces.
Yeah, it was meant to be written simply. There's a number of people who have really appreciated that, and it's kind of like how I relate to people is pretty simply, and that's what we wanted the book to be, and that's what it came out to be, which was really nice. And people say they can either read it quickly or they can read chapter by chapter or story by story, because as you've read the book and you know that it's filled with my own personal stories of relationships and all the faux pas I've made and all the ins and outs I've done in, relationships in work and with friends and in my marriage and with my sons and daughter. And it's just, it's somewhat, I don't know if entertaining is the right word, but I think a lot of people have told me that it's pretty engaging while being simple at the same time.
So now you have a bit of a better idea about the premise of the book and the way the book is structured. When we come back, we're going to take our first break of the podcast, obviously. And when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about the structure of the book and the way Larry's writing is approachable and relatable. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with Larry Shushansky about his book, Independent Enough. And before the break, Larry was speaking about the structure of the book, the way the book is written, how it is made to be very approachable and relatable. And we are going to continue talking a bit about that structure of the book. So let's go ahead and get back to the interview.
Yeah, I think it's really relational. Not to use a pun, but it's very relational. So that while it's not like you're right, entertaining might not be the right word, but it's very relatable, and you can see where the stories are coming from, and it's easy to step into those stories as you tell them.
Yeah, I've learned that, being a therapist or an author and a speaker, that I'm really nothing special. I've got the same flaws and difficulties and struggles as everybody else has. And it's what really connects me with everybody. And it's what enabled me to write the book in the first place, because a lot of us have a tendency to think that we're neurotic or we're just not doing things right, or, life is too much of an effort, but it's just who we are as people. And hopefully that comes across in the book as well. And hopefully it comes across when I do speaking engagements too.
Yeah. So give us kind of a brief overview of the premise of the book.
The premise of the book, one of the core ideas behind the book is I believe that all conflict in all relationships stems from dependency, but not all dependency creates conflict. I think every relationship that we're in, there's a certain amount of dependency that's involved in that. Our short relationship here, in terms of our talking, I'm dependent on you to kind of lead me and to get this podcast out. You're dependent on me to be somewhat stable and logical and reasonable about the way I present, and to try to have the best quality podcast as possible. So we have a reliance or a dependence on one another. And the closer we are to people, the more those dependencies grow. In our society and in our culture, there's this strive towards being independent totally. And I just don't think that's possible to do. Dependency is an integral part of any relationship. And it's what creates the bond we have with other. And the longer we're in relationship, the more dependent we become on that relationship. Generally speaking, that's fine. The problem is when we run into conflict, that actually stems from that dependency, which is healthy, which has turned unhealthy. So basically, anytime we rely on someone else for our well-being and that person does not carry through the way we want them to carry through, that's oftentimes what creates the conflict. Whether it's something simple from being late to being messy to intimacy needs and sexuality, and just across the board, it's our disappointment in other and our trying to get other to do what we want them to do. And that's what creates most of the conflict. Again, it's when we depend on the other person for our well-being and the expectations for that. And generally speaking, we can run fine with that. But when that doesn't work, that's what creates the conflict. So the idea behind the book is that when we enter into the conflict, it's important to, and we do this, what I'm about to describe is what we do anyway. If we have any level of success in any kind of relationship, whether work relationship or even us doing this podcast together or friendships or long-term intimate relationships or family relationships, if we have any level of success, what I'm about to describe is what we do unconsciously anyway. We just don't know it. And so what it's about is that when we enter into conflict, it's about taking a step back away from the relationship and getting what I call the noise. That means getting all the criticism and judgments and all that fuzziness about the other person out of our heads, as well as getting the criticism and judgments about ourselves out of our heads. And that's an important step. And most of us don't do this. We live in a culture that is constantly blaming others. If you look at politics, I mean, it's what it's all about. It's all about they did this, they did that kind of thing. And it's almost a knee-jerk. We almost learn it from the time we're very, very small, that I didn't do it, it's their fault kind of mentality. And so what this first step is it's taking a step back and getting all of that stuff, all the judgments, all the criticisms, all the thoughts about the other person and ourselves out of our heads. And a lot of times you can even physically remove yourself to get that kind of distance. Not withdrawn though, but it's just enough distance to calm our minds down. And that once we're able to calm our minds down, then we go into self-reflection. And self-reflection is not about taking personal responsibility. It's about who am I in this conflict? What part am I playing in this conflict? Am I being overbearing? Am I being too passive? Am I being aggressive? Am I being a victim? Am I being whatever it happens to be, what is my part of this? Am I being overly dependent? Are my expectations too high? Do I there's so many different parts of the self-reflection that we can get into. But once we do that self-reflection and we say to ourselves, this is who I am in this conflict, then we can make a decision about what we want to do that's tied to the self-reflection. For example, if I think I'm being too passive in a conflict, then I can decide to learn how to be more assertive in this conflict. So first I get the noise out of my head, then I look at myself and I go, that's a pretty passive stance in relation to the other person. So I want to learn how to be more assertive in relation to this person. So then I do what I need to do that. I could read, I could go into therapy, I could just come up with more assertive statements in my mind. I could work on myself. And that's what healthy relationships do. It's about personal growth. And that when I find what I need to do in relation to the other person, which by the way is generally what I need to do in life. It's not just with our intimate partners, the people that we're having the conflict with. These are characteristics, let's say, with assertiveness that I've probably had to develop my whole entire life. So I start to learn, I think in my mind what I need to do. And then once I make that decision about what I want to do, I step back into the relationship and I practice my assertiveness. Now, the last step is that we have this image in our heads anytime we make a decision like this, and we kind of play it out without even knowing it of what it's going to look like, what our part's going to look like, and what the other person's part's going to look like. very, very seldom does that ever work out like we planned it in our heads. So when we step back in, real probably, it's not going to work out like we wanted it to work out. So then we have to repeat the steps all over again. And this process of taking a step back, self-reflecting, making the changes we want to make, and stepping back in a relationship is what self-growth is all about. And it's that self-growth that creates healthy relationships. We often think that we're at the mercy of other people. If they would just be nicer, if they would be kinder, if they would be more loving, if they would be more understanding, we often think our relationships would be better. What we do is disempower ourselves. But when we follow this process, either naturally or consciously, either unconsciously or consciously, we take control. We can create the kinds of relationships we want, regardless of what somebody else does. And that's a pretty novel idea for most people. Again, most people think it has to be the other person to change for my relationship to be what I want to be. But I can actually lead a relationship, not in a domineering way, not in a controlling way, not in an abusive way, but in a self-growth way. And as I grow, that's how my relationship can grow as well. So that's it in a nutshell.
Okay, well, thank you for that. One thing that I appreciate about this book is that, the tagline is a book about relationships. And I think often when people hear the word relationship, they tend to think romantic relationship. And
right.
This book can be used for any kind of relationship, romantic, platonic, work, etc.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. Because if you think about the work situations that we're in, we become dependent on them as well. We become dependent on our boss and middle management and our colleagues, and we depend on them to do what we want them to do to make our work situations better, kind of thing. So yeah, it can be friendships. I'm constantly disappointed by my friends. So I called my buddy last weekend, and it was on Sunday, and it was during the Patriots game, and I didn't realize it was during the Patriots game. And he just blasted me, just blew me out of the water for having the nerve to call him during the Patriots game. And so I have to deal with that. This is my best friend, and so I don't want to just knock him out of my life kind of thing. But it's dealing with that kind of conflict because I'm dependent on him and he's dependent on me. And so we worked it out.
Well, that's good.
One of the ways we worked it out is I know, like today, the Patriots game is on at 4:30, so I won't call him tonight.
Note to self, check the Patriots schedule before picking up the phone. Yeah.
Exactly right. And that sounds pretty simplistic. But when we get into those kinds of situations, as minor as that really is, when we get into those kind of situations, we get hurt. We take a step back. We get a little tweaked around this. And our tendency, again, is to go, what's the matter with him? It's only a stupid Patriots game. I'm his best buddy. Why can't he talk to me, kind of thing? And so we go through all the stuff in our heads, and over time that erodes relationships that we're in, even a good relationship like this, unless we do the work of personal growth that we need to do.
I feel like all of us maybe have that one friend that we should know that we can't call during, maybe it's not the Patriots game, maybe it's Dancing with the Stars. For my parents, it's NCIS. We all have that one friend. They have different levels of politeness as to how they reply or respond when you call them, but yeah, we've probably all had a similar experience. We're going to go ahead and take another break. When we come back, we'll be talking about one of these specific examples, one of the first stories that Larry shares in the book about a situation and that he encountered with in his relationship with his wife. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with Larry Shushansky about his book, Independent Enough. Before the break, we were talking about his friend and that fateful call during the Patriots game. We're going to talk about a different example, this time an example that happened in his relationship with his wife. So let's go ahead and get back to the episode, or to the interview.
In fact, the first story that you tell in the book, you talk about the simple fact that you and your wife have different sleep patterns. One of you goes to bed early, one of you goes to bed late. And, you know, it was bothering both of you, so you tried to compromise, and that didn't make anyone happy. And I think that's often how we come at relationships. Well, how are we going to compromise? And that doesn't always work. Sometimes it can, but you went through a process of your own self-reflection. Why am I upset about this? You know, that she goes to bed later than I do. And you figure it out, but you didn't just figure it out and poof, everything was perfect. You know, because relationships, right. we are imperfect human beings, and we backslide all the time. So for me, that's one of the things that I very much appreciate about your book is the reminder that we aren't perfect, and we aren't going to get everything right just by, oh, wow, I figured that out. That made sense. Now everything's right in this situation. And you even end the book with repeat.
Right, exactly right. That's what it's all about, repeating. I believe that in long-term relationships, again, work relationships, friendships, intimate partner relationships, that there are 3 or 4 key issues between me and other that never get solved. Like this thing about going to sleep together. I mean, my wife and I have settled pretty well, but even this weekend, because she's sick and she wanted me to sleep with her, but I didn't want to get sick, and so we had a little back and forth about that. Because I think those 3 or 4 key issues, they never get resolved. But what happens, for example, that you just gave about going to sleep together, our disagreement around this, or our conflict around this, looked differently the first year we were married. It looked differently the 10th year we were married, the 20th year we were married, and the 35th year we're married. We evolved the issue along. It didn't stay stagnant. And in a lot of relationships, the issue stays stagnant. Now, I don't expect to ever solve this. I mean, probably to the day we die, we won't solve this. But it evolves along. And as we evolve this issue, we evolve as individuals and as a couple. And that's where our love really, really gets deep and tender. As we're making a commitment to each other and to ourselves to evolve the same issue over and over and over and over and over again. And that's, you know, a lot of our expectations are exactly what you say. If I do this once, or we've talked about this 10 times, why do we have to keep talking about it? Well, because there hasn't been the personal growth and there hasn't been the evolution. People get tired of talking or dealing with the same issues, but it's just, I don't know, I don't remember if this is even in the book or not, but when my father was dying of prostate cancer, he had gotten down to about 80-some pounds. He was like half his body weight. And it was a couple of days before, he died, and he's lying in the hospital bed. And my parents had argued about the way he ate for years because he had a heart attack. And, for example, early on in the marriage, when we were younger, my mom, we didn't have a lot of money, so my mom would buy these Delmonico steaks like for a real treat, and she cooked vegetables along with it. And when she turned her back, my father would slip into the refrigerator and douse it with ketchup, and they would just be off and running from there, just because he just ate horribly. He just never really took care of himself much when it came to eating. So 2 days before he died, there was this plate of hospital food for dinner in front of him that was across a tray, and a standing tray, and he had finished most of the dinner, and the woman came and took the dinner away, but my mother picked up this pukey green Jell-O and put it in front of him, and she looked at him, and very softly and kindly and with a lot of affection, she says to him, Hyman, you have to eat the Jell-O. And his soft voice, he goes, I'm not going to eat the Jell-O. And in a little stronger voice, she says, you're going to eat the Jell-O. And in a little stronger voice, he goes, I'm not eating the Jell-O. She takes a spoon and she dips it into the Jell-O and she moves it towards him. And with as much energy as I've seen him have in weeks, he sits up in bed and he looks at it and he goes, I'm not eating the Jell-O, now leave me alone. And he plops back in bed. And I say to myself, oh my God, he's dying. Can't you leave him alone? But that kind of commitment was a commitment to this, even to the day he died. They were committed to one another to keep this issue on the table. So he dies 2 days later. He died somewhere between 5 and 7 o'clock in the morning. So they call my mother. They wait until about 9. They call my mother, and she's just beside herself. They were married 47 years. She was beside herself. She calls my nephew to pick her up. She collects herself. She takes a shower. She asks them to keep his body in the room so she can come say goodbye. She gets there about noon. Now, you can imagine he's rigor mortis has set in. It's been 7 or 8 hours. He's probably the death pale white. His eyes are sunken in. His cheekbones are high is what I imagine. And she said to me, she says, Larry, I walked into your father's room and I looked at him and he looked as handsome as the first day that I met him. And I walked over to him and I kissed him on the lips and I said, hi, I will never love another man like I love you. And even now it brings tears to my eyes, because that tenderness went along with their conflict around that issue. And a lot of times what we try to do is cut out the conflict in our relationship. But when you try to make it too perfect, when you cut out that conflict, you've cut out a significant part of relationships. And I'm not talking about abuse, and I'm not talking about like yelling and screaming or any of that kind of stuff. But I'm talking more about issues that repeat themselves over and over and over again, and making a commitment to those as an integral part of the relationship. It's almost like a tapestry. You know, if you ever look at a tapestry, like there's a Moreau tapestry up in the Smithsonian in Washington years and years and years ago, and you look from afar, and it's like 3 stories. The thing is huge, and you looked at it, and it was absolutely gorgeous. And as you got closer to it, you noticed all the flaws in the tapestry. You know, all the ends that were torn, that were not completed, that was not properly done, kind of thing. And you go, yes, that's what it's about. It's not about a perfect. It's about learning how to take those flaws, take those conflicts, take those difficulties. And I mean, if you think my wife wakes up every morning and looks at me and goes, my, what a handsome man, glad I married him, doesn't happen. She and I both have to learn how to deal with the parts of the relationship that don't work for us. And that's what my parents did for 47 years.
Some mornings I wake up and look at my husband and think, oh, maybe I'll just put a pillow over there and ignore you for a while, you know? And totally understand. I'm not going to smother him with the pillow. I'm just going to move it so I don't have to look at him. And then other mornings it's like, oh, look at him. He's so handsome and cute and wonderful.
Sarah, that's exactly right. And to do away with those mornings when he's not as particularly attractive to you is a mistake, because it's just not perfect. But what a lot of people do is they'll wake up on those mornings and they'll look at their husbands and they'll go, and they'll withdraw. Or they'll take those kind of moments or those kinds of conflicts or the tensions or the things that they don't like, and it begins to erode the relationship. And part of self-growth that we need to do is how we do not let that erode the relationship. How we can look at those times and have that become an integral part of the love that we have for somebody. That's a terrific example, Sarah.
In addition to the book, at the end there's also a workbook that you provide. So in terms of
Yes.
that workbook, what do you hope readers will take from that?
What I've learned is that this takes practice. I hate to call it work, but it's more like practice to continue to self-grow, to continue to look at ourselves and self-reflect, to continue to make decisions and stepping into relationships. It's a practice. It's a daily practice. I do this almost every day in my mind, one way or the other. I saw a terrific movie last night, by the way. It was called It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. It's about Mr. Rogers and a magazine writer who interviewed him, and he was really wounded. And it was about their relationship and how it evolved over time. But one of the striking parts about it was that his wife in the movie, and I know this because I also saw the documentary. This is a fictional story based on a true story. But the documentary, which was put out about 8 months ago about Mr. Rogers, is that he practiced every day being the kind of person he wanted to be. He would pray. He would read scripture. He would work out. He would think about things differently. He would practice on a daily basis who he wanted to be as a person. And then every day, I'm trying to think of the man's name. I can't remember his name now. He's a New York Times.
Well, actually, his name in the movie is different from the reporter's name in real life, I believe. I think I read an article,
is it?
But I think so.
Okay.
So,
okay.
So, I mean, that's not here nor there.
I think his name was Lloyd in the movie, kind of thing. But one of the issues that was struck me is how much work Mr. Rogers had to put in to become the kind of person he wanted to be in relation to everybody he met through his days. And that's what this is about. It's making that kind of commitment, because we're making a commitment to the relationships in our lives, but we're also making a commitment to ourselves to be the happiest and to be as balanced as we possibly can, to have a picture of who we want to be in different relationships in our lives, and then to practice that. And that's what the workbook is about. It's about practice. And what I try to do in the workbook, because there's what I've learned doing 40 years of therapy, is that people learn at different paces, and they learn, the learning styles are different. So what I tried to include was as many different ways of working on the same issue as possible. And it's a tough task to do, and I hope I covered most learning styles in it, or at least enough that people can get what they need to get. But that's what the workbook is about. It's about the daily work we need to do. Oftentimes when I do readings in the morning, I come across something that I'm reading, and there's a shift in my mind, like a aha moment kind of thing, like a little tweak in my mind. I stop reading at that point, and I carry that phrase or that word or that paragraph or that concept with me through the day. And I may even carry it through a couple of days, because that's what I know I need to work on. That's what that shift is all about. That shift tells us what issues we need to work on, or more specifically, that shift tells us what we need to do to grow to become who we want to become. And so that's what I do. And I may practice it every 15 minutes, every half an hour, once an hour. And if I forget for 4 or 5 hours, I'll pick it back up in my mind. And that's what I do daily. And that's what the workbook is about. Trying to incorporate growth on a daily basis. So that's what it's about.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for that. You also do speaking engagements. You mentioned that earlier.
Yes.
So when you do speaking engagements, are those usually in larger groups? Are they smaller groups? So you get one-on-one interactions with people? How do those normally work?
They're both. I do small groups. I do book clubs. I've done book clubs of 10, 15 people, and then I've done conferences of 150 people. And I try to make it as conversational as possible, as informal as possible. It's harder to do with larger groups, but I usually leave time for questions and answers and back and forth and people who challenge me, and I love to be challenged. And so what I try to do with speaking engagements is make it as informal as possible and use a lot of storytelling and a lot of examples. And I ask for examples from people in the audience as well. And it's a lot of back and forth kinds of, it's almost like it's as much of a conversation as I can possibly make it, because that's the best learning tool for people. And my idea is really not to make money from this, because a lot of the books I just give out for free, particularly with speaking engagements that I do. But it's more about trying to get this idea out to more people. You know, I've been a therapist for 40 years, and I see a lot of couples and a lot of individuals who are struggling in relationships, either work or their personal relationships. And what I've tried to do is, once I got cured of hepatitis C, I had the energy to start to think and to start to move out from behind closed doors into the community at large. And that's the purpose of what I'm trying to do now. That's what this podcast is about, trying to reach as many people as I can possibly reach.
Let's go ahead and take our third and final break of the podcast. And when we come back, the conclusion of my interview with Larry. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with Larry Shushansky about his book, Independent Enough, a book about relationships. And we've been talking about a lot of different topics and a lot of different experiences that he has had and has been able to share in this book. So let's go ahead and get back to the conclusion of that interview with Larry.
In addition to speaking engagements, I know you've written articles, you've written blogs. Do you plan on writing another book, do you think?
Well, I want to try to, like I said, I want to try to get the word out around this to as many people as possible, as opposed to writing another book. I write a weekly blog, and articles are sporadic. I just wrote an article for a web page in England. And periodically I write blogs for NAMI, which is National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. But basically I want to try to get this idea that the book presents out to as many people as possible. So before writing another book, people have encouraged me to write a book composed of the blogs. I've been writing a blog for about 3-4 years now, and they think that would make a nice addition to this book, a nice follow-up to this book, but I really want to concentrate on trying to get, I don't know a way to say it other than the word out. I want to try to get the word out around this book. Other than that, I do the weekly blogs, and the weekly blogs pretty much follow the format of the book in terms of personal stories. I don't like telling stories of clients. I feel that that's not a breach of confidentiality, but it's awkward if I tell a story about a client that they've told me in confidence. So I try to keep it as much about myself as possible. And trust me, there's enough interactions I have with people, places, and things that I've got plenty of material to work with. Because like you said earlier, none of us are perfect. Really, it's amazing how much work I've done on myself and how much work I still have to do. And I guess that's a good thing. But
I think in this day and age, we so often want that quick fix. We want to pick up a book like yours and just read through it and be like, okay, perfect, I can do that and everything will work out fine. But, life doesn't work that way.
Right, and neither do relationships. And as much of a mentality we have that about trying to find the answer in a particular book, we also try to do that in relationships as well. And I think it's one of the myths behind relationships that if I do the right thing, if I find the right answer, if I find one of the myths is if I find the right person, then my life will be blissful. My relationships will be exactly what I want them to be. I don't think it's about finding the right person. I think it's about being the right person, whether it be sexual or whether it be out of the bedroom or rather wherever you go. With whatever kind of relationships we're talking about, it's really about being who you need to become to make the kind of relationships you want. So that's one myth I think that is really hard to dispel because, like you're saying, people want to get really quick, fast. Let's do it. Let me get on with my life, and so I don't have to struggle at all. But I don't think that's realistic. The other myth, which and this is off topic a little bit, but the other myth which you brought up earlier, which is about compromise, we are often taught that you need to learn how to compromise in order to have a good relationship. I don't agree with that. I think that compromise is a shortcut to self-growth and moving relationships further. Compromise is basically, I give up something that I don't want to give up. You give up something that you don't want to give up, right? In order for us to minimize or do away with conflict. The problem with that is that if I'm giving up something I don't want and you're giving up something you don't want, I'm going to be looking at you to make sure you're doing your part. And you're going to be looking at me to make sure I do my part. So in a way, compromise actually creates a seed of mistrust as opposed to establishing more trust and deeper senses of trust. So that's another myth I think people work with. It's better to hash out, work out, self-growth, move through, continue moving the relationship forward by moving ourselves forward individually. That's the bang for the buck as opposed to compromise, compromise is more of a legal thing. I don't know if you've ever been in any kind of lawsuit or any kind of accident or any of that kind of stuff, or a plumber that doesn't do what he or she needs to do and you take them to court kind of thing. It's all about compromise. And legally, when the parties walk away from a compromise, they feel very unsatisfied because it just doesn't do what you want it to do. So I think that's another myth that we live with that's really unhealthy.
Yeah, and I host the book review podcast here on the podcast network, and one of my favorite genres is romance, and I love the happily ever after because I like to read books that have a happy ending, But I also know that that's not, the happily ever after is a great way to end a book, but it doesn't really exist, You don't just ride off into the sunset and never fight again, or.
Well, what you're saying is true. It's the end of the book. So there's what happens next kind of thing.
Right.
And it's not the end of the story. And we buy that, through movies are the same way, television romances are the same way, blogs, research that we, even therapists will will imply that if you do certain things, your life is going to be so much easier and you're going to go off into the sunset happily ever after. And I think you make a tremendous point. It just doesn't work that way. Now, that doesn't mean we have to be unhappy the rest of our lives. I'm not suggesting that. But to think that we can be in relationships personal relationships, work relationships, any kind of relationship that we're in, and that's going to run smooth for our entire life, I think is just a setup for all of us. You're exactly right. That doesn't mean you can't have romantic love. You know, there was a book called The Road Less Traveled, put out by a man named Scott Peck, and this was, I don't know, 15 years ago or so, 20 years ago or so. And one of the premises of that book is that all love dies. All romantic love dies. And then what you do is that it takes work to create real love. And so that shifts from romantic love to real love, which is often so disappointing in our lives. And we often say to ourselves, well, this must not be the right person for me. It's not true. It's just that romance always slips away, and then it's up to us to do what we need to do to build that real deep, deep love. I mean, I feel closer to my wife now than I ever have in my life. In fact, I feel closer to my wife than I have ever felt to anybody in my life. And yet I feel more of a sense of independence from her than I've ever felt in my life. It's like you can't love somebody too close. You have to love somebody at a certain distance, because I think that's real love. And the more and more independent we can become in conflict or in general, I think the happier and more loving you can be, because then you're truly loving somebody for who that person is, as opposed to what they can do for you. And even in sexuality and in romance, it just becomes so much more tender and so much more soft and so much more meaningful and so much more, let me just ease into this. And again, that doesn't last because of the issues and the things that we've been talking about. But over a period of time, there's more and more and more overall times like that. And it's really sweet. Mm-hmm. It really is.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you have a website, so tell people where they can find your website and if you have any social media that people can connect with you on.
Sure. The website is independentenough.com. On that website, people can actually download the book for free, and you can also access the blogs from that independentenough.com. And if people go to the contact page on independentenough.com, I'll put them on a mailing list. It's a notification of when the blogs are published. The social media is all independentenough.com, whether it's LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. It's all independentenough.com. Some of it is Larry Shushansky, independentenough.com, but if you just put up independentenough.com, it'll come up.
Okay, easy enough. Thank you. We've talked about a lot today, which has been great. But is there anything that we haven't covered that you really wanted to bring up during this podcast?
I don't think there is. I think we've covered the essence. There's a lot of particulars around this that is different for every individual. And if people want, they can actually go to the website, and on the contact page, which is confidential, nobody else sees that, they can ask me questions if they want, and I can answer that on the website. I can't do therapy that way, but I can answer questions, the particular questions that somebody might have, because and that's part of the struggle. There are so many different ways to have good relationships that there really is no one answer. And so I don't try to have an answer to people's relationships or the conflicts or the difficulties in relationships, or when they're not having the relationships they want. It's all set in a process of personal growth and movement. And that's for a million different people. There's a million different ways of doing that. And it's a commitment to self and to relationship to do that over and over and over again on a daily basis. But I think other than that, I think you've covered a lot of the essentials.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it. The book is Independent Enough. The website is independentenough.com. So if people want to learn more, they can certainly go there and learn more about this really great approach to relationships.
Yeah. And Sarah, thank you so much. You're welcome for me being on the podcast, but I really appreciate you allowing me to be on the podcast. That means a lot to me. Thank you so much.
Once again, thank you so much to Larry for taking the time to talk to me. I mean, he said thank you for allowing him on the podcast, but that's just crazy talk. Of course, I would, I wanted him to come onto the podcast to talk about his book, to talk about his work, and I really appreciate him sharing so much of himself in that process. So thank you to Larry. Thank you, as always, to you, our listeners. If you're a fan of this podcast, if you like what you hear, then we would be very happy if you, the royal we, I guess, I would especially be very grateful if you would follow us on social media, like, retweet, share, do all those wonderful things, as well as subscribing to this podcast and leaving us a nice review. A 5-star review is great. A written review is lovely. Just whatever you feel compelled to do this holiday season. Yeah, I threw the holiday card in there. Sorry. So thank you, as always, for joining me. Join me again on Tuesday when I will be interviewing author Kimberly B. Jones about her young adult book, Our Friendship Matters. And I am looking forward to speaking with her and talking about her book. Join me on Tuesday for that conversation. In the meantime, have a wonderful weekend and hope you find a lot of time to get yourself lost in a good book.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.